West, farmers had been suffering for quite some time, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act was created to try to help with that. One thing it did that was highly controversial was it set quotas for crops to be grown, and it did this by paying farmers not to grow crops on parts of their land. It even destroyed crops that were grown. Now, that may seem crazy. Why are we growing less if people are starving? But this is an attempt to reduce the supply, which would raise the price and make it profitable to make this stuff in the first place. On a related note, for example, 6 million pigs were killed, and then quicklime was put on the pigs to make them poisonous so nobody could eat them. Now, this may seem crazy, like I said, but this was done so that the price of that product would go up and the industry would return. This was widely criticized, but it did work to some extent. Now, this idea of paying farmers not to grow on their land might have been great for the landowners, but it was a disaster for the sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Of course, if the government comes in and says, don't grow crops on half of your land, you don't need those sharecroppers and tenant farmers, and they join the ranks of the migratory, wandering, desperate, unemployed. And of course, during this period, it stopped raining in parts of Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, creating the enormous natural disaster we call the Dust Bowl. One Oklahoma paper said not a blade of wheat, cattle dying on the range, 90% of poultry dead because of the sandstorms, milk cows gone dry. How severe was this? Well, in 1934, dust from the Dust Bowl ends up blowing all the way to Washington, D.C. One dust storm moved enough soil from Texas to Colorado to fill the Grand Canyon if it would have gone into the Grand Canyon, which, to be clear, it did not. Now, this was caused by an interesting phenomena. Because the Great Plains had been sitting there since creation and had never been really plowed, they'd never been really used for intense agriculture. The very first time they were cultivated with heavy farm equipment, with disc plows and steam tractors, which really turned up all that topsoil that had been packed in there for so long. Now, this made it incredibly fertile land. It was very great if you were a farmer. But the first time a drought came and dried that soil up, it meant there was just an incredible amount of loose soil there. It's something that really, like, the world had never seen before. To dry up and then be picked up by the winds. If anybody here has ever been up to this part of the world, up around the Panhandle in Texas, you understand the type of wind we're talking about. That it created something unique. This was not the worst drought in that region or the world or anything like that. It was just a unique phenomenon where you had taken land that had settled there millions of years ago and for the first time had been turned over. And so the first time there was a drought there. If you can look at these pictures, look at these dust storms. They're bigger than these houses. They killed infants who just didn't have the capacity to breathe in these if they weren't protected. Anybody with any sort of respiratory issue, if you had asthma and you got out in this stuff, it was going to kill you. And some of these dust storms, if you were out with your skin exposed, it would just flay the flesh off your skin. I mean, it's difficult to explain how horrific and destructive the Dust Bowl as a natural phenomena was. This is also the subject, at least in some sense, of the great novel, The Grapes of Wrath, that documents the Okies moving out to California, who I'll talk more about later. The Resettlement Administration moved families to government-planned communities, many of which were in California, which is going to be a big thing here in a second. The idea of owning land, of course, had been the dream of Europeans coming to America since they first began to come to America. Land had meant security. Land had meant the ability to support yourself. And that had evolved into the idea of owning your own home as the American dream. Way back in the 1850s, Walt Whitman had said, "A man is not a whole and complete man unless he owns a house and the ground it stands on." I think that's evolving today for interesting reasons I'll talk about much later in the course, but that was certainly the attitude at the time and when I was a kid. Before World War I, a higher percent of immigrants than U.S.-born workers even owned their own home, which is interesting. Construction essentially stops in the Great Depression, and there's 250,000 foreclosures on homes in 1932. Hoover had called a home a birthright and held a conference on housing in 1931, which revealed crowded urban tenements and rural shacks. Private enterprise had failed. Hoover created the Federal Mortgage Bank, and FDR takes the Fed into housing. The Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1933 and the Federal Housing Authority in 1934 insured mortgages. We also began to build public housing. The FHA and later the Veterans Administration often made getting a mortgage cheaper than getting rent. And so this begins under Hoover and is greatly intensified under FDR. And really, the government intervenes to make it possible for regular folks to buy their own home. There were other programs. The Federal Communications Commission comes along to regulate like radio waves and stuff like that. The Security Exchange Commission is set up to be the cops on Wall Street. You can decide for yourself how successful that has been. Prohibition is repealed. Remember, that's one of the things FDR ran on with the 21st Amendment. And they open up those breweries and distilleries and put people back to work in them. And people get back to drinking legally. I mean, let's be real. They hadn't actually stopped drinking, but now it's legal again. But the New Deal was largely experiments. Some worked, others didn't. But it radically changed the role of government. It built the infrastructure of the United States. It fed millions of people. But one thing it did not do, and I want to be clear about this, is it did not end the Great Depression. In 1934, when FDR tried to end the New Deal after just 2 years, unemployment still sat at 20%. That's 10 million people. A quick note about unemployment. When I say unemployment, I don't mean that's all the people without a job. What I mean is, of the people who want to work, of the people who are actively trying to work, plus the people who have jobs, in this case, 20%, 1 in 5 of those people can't find a job. You may be thinking, well, my mom stays home with the kids, and my little sister doesn't work because she's 8, and my grandparents don't work. That's not what unemployment means. It means 1 in 5 people who want to work, who can work, can't find a job. The conservative Supreme Court is still stuck on liberty of contract. They struck down the National Recovery Act in May of 1935. They also, with the Schechter Poultry case, they said the Interstate Commerce Act does not apply. And they said the National Recovery Act gave legislative powers to the executive. In U.S. v. Butler in January of 36, they struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And in June of 1936, they struck down New York State's minimum wage for women and children as the first New Deal ends. The only thing that had been really able to slow it down at all was the Supreme Court.